Hello, everybody. This is Deborah Owen of Einstein's Secret, and I am really excited this afternoon to be able to introduce you to Jeff Brown, who is the podcaster for the Read to Lead podcast. Welcome, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Deborah. I'm excited to be here. It sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is great. Well, I would love it if you would please introduce yourself to our viewers and our audience and tell us a little bit about your journey to getting to be the podcaster that you are today.
Well, yeah, prior to this, I spent about 25, 26 years in broadcasting. Started at the age of around 21, kind of fell into it. That's not what I went to school for initially. I was going to be a music education major, music teacher. Ended up dropping out of school and not really knowing what I wanted to do. I went back, got a degree in business, and during that time sort of fell into radio. I'd always been fascinated by that and managed to sort of force my way into a radio station and, sweeping floors or doing whatever I could do to get that first job. And off and on for 26 years up until June of this year, I've done radio in some form or fashion. It was in June when me and two of my colleagues actually were let go, were downsized on the same day. And I had already been formulating this idea for a podcast anyway and was already in the planning stages. And so just went forward with that and been doing this since July.
Well, that's great that you had a plan B all set.
Well, the podcast isn't something that it's not like a revenue generator for me right now. It's not, it's not how I'm making a living at this point. I hope to be able to monetize it at some point. But in 2010, I had also launched a side business, sort of something I was doing in the margins of life, where I help small businesses create websites for their business and even mobile apps for their business. And so when this job change or loss came in June, I decided to sort of pour myself into that 100% and have been making ends meet that way. And then the podcast is just a passion, something that I'll do regardless of whether it helps pay the bills or not. It's just something I love to do and would do anyway. And so I'll continue to do that. I love it. And if someday down the road it brings in revenue as well, then all the better.
That's great. Now, I'm interested. You said that you went to school for music education.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What's your instrument, or what do you play?
French horn
Okay.
was my principal instrument, and frankly, I just got. I ended up in college bored with the instrument, unfortunately, and just deciding that after a semester of student teaching at the junior high level, something that I found incredibly difficult,
Yes.
I decided that maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Now, the person I am now, I look back on that and go, man, I would love to teach at some point in my life now. I feel like I'm matured enough to to actually teach. But at that time in my life, I was not ready, particularly the junior high level, to dedicate my life to teaching, and didn't think I was cut out for it. So
Yeah.
after that, I let it go. So
Yeah. My one of my first teaching jobs was at the junior high level, and if you had told me 10 years before I would be a junior high teacher, I would have said no. But as it happened, by the time I got to that level, I had middle school kids myself, and so it seemed like but
Okay.
of course, not a problem. So
Yeah.
well, life experiences prepare us for certain things, don't they?
Yes, they do. They do.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, speaking about your podcast, what led you to decide to do a podcast about reading specifically?
Well, I'm a passionate reader, a voracious reader, I like to say. Unfortunately, that passion came for me. I would consider relatively late in life. I was in my mid-30s when I began developing a passion for reading, and that was in part because I had a leader where I was working, the last radio job I was at, who brought books into the workplace, and we read them as a staff and went through them as a staff. And then prior to that, in school. When I had to read, I kind of saw reading as a chore or as a homework. And while I was in this work situation, having quote unquote to read, I found that having a group of people, these colleagues around me to bounce things off of that I was reading, fascinating. And the types of books that we were reading as a group were books that I'd never ventured into before, mostly nonfiction. Books about business. Things like marketing and leadership and entrepreneurship and those kind of things. And as embarrassed as I am to say this, at 35, I really wasn't aware of the level of knowledge that was crammed in books, that was just, for the taking. I didn't realize that you could read, 4 or 5 books on a subject and know more about that subject than most of the rest of the population. And that just fascinated me. I had seen reading as a chore, and I was aware of, the books that were available, but I just didn't think there was anything there for me. But when I started reading people like Seth Godin, and Pat Lencioni and Jim Collins and people like that, I'm like, wow, this is just incredible. Yeah. And so, I'm the kind of person that as soon as I learn something, I want to share it with people. I want to share it with as many people as I can, sort of that teaching thing coming back into play.
Right.
And so for me, the podcast is a vehicle with which to do that, to share what I've learned. And my listener, learns right along with me as we discuss these topics with whoever the author is that particular week. But I'm also very sort of scratching the itch of frustration that other people don't read more than they do. I read a couple of statistics recently that over 40% of college students will never read another book after they graduate.
Wow.
And another statistic was like 1 in 5 U.S. families. How did it go? 1 of 5 U.S. families bought a book in the last year. Just 1 in 5 bought a single book.
I think I'm making up for most of the others.
I feel like I am too. And so it's frustrations like that, trying to, spur more reading, trying to encourage people to read more, in part because of my belief that it plays a role in your success in business and in life. And even if I can't convince somebody to turn that into a habit, maybe my podcast can serve as sort of an audio Cliff's Notes, if you will.
Yeah. I'm actually finding that I as I listen to most of your podcasts, I'm going through saying, I got to add that to my Amazon wish list. I got to add that one to my Amazon wish list. And of course, I can't get to them all. So there are some I'm just making a conscious decision. Okay, I'm not going to get to this one, but boy, I sure am glad I got the Cliff Notes version on it. So
good.
Yeah, it's definitely been terrific to be able to learn along with you. I appreciate that. That's terrific.
Good. Thank you.
Let me ask you this. Since I also teach students about online interactions, what do you see as some of the benefits of podcasting as a way to interact with an audience? I'm actually working with some business students right now. We're working on developing a social media curriculum, but we're kind of also talking in general about what it means to be online. So what are for instance, podcasting, what are some of the benefits do you see?
Well, one of the first ones that comes to mind is people can take a podcast anywhere. If I'm going to read a blog post or if I'm going to watch a video somebody's created, I have to be looking at the screen. And so podcasting doesn't ask that of you. It's a very intimate medium, like radio, the medium that I come from. Mm-hmm. And so you can be along with people as they cooking dinner, as they're driving to work or wherever they're going, as they're on their morning run or working out in the gym. You can be there with them and they can engage in your content while doing those other things. It doesn't require as much from them. Mm-hmm. They can just listen and get out of it what you're trying to relay. And so that's I guess the main difference. Podcasting I think is a great foundation for establishing your expertise in a particular area, your thought leadership. I read a statistic recently that said there are 900 blogs for every one podcast.
Right.
So if you're looking to get into an area that's not overly saturated, I'm not saying you shouldn't start a blog, because that's certainly a legitimate way to establish, again, those things like thought leadership and expertise in a particular area that you're passionate about. But it's a whole lot less crowded in podcasting. It's still a relatively low barrier to entry, but the barrier to entry is high enough that most people look at it and shy away from it. Mm-hmm. And two, that it's sort of a demonstration of the fact that there are no gatekeepers anymore. In my lifetime. And in yours, when I tried to get into radio, I literally had to know somebody. Okay. I had to get in the good graces of somebody who would let me work at the radio station and work my way up to being on the air. Today, if you're a musician like your son and you want your songs to get heard, you don't necessarily have to wait for a label to sign you. you can be like the group Walk Off the Earth, who does wonderful cover tunes and their own original material, and create a video of someone that I used to know, of the five of them gathered around a guitar, playing it all at the same time, and have millions of people watch your video. And nobody had to give them permission to do that.
Right.
And so if you've ever wanted to, be on the radio, let's say, you don't have to wait for permissions to do that. You can create a podcast and share your content with the world, essentially.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. And I think it was Seth Godin who first said, "Choose yourself."
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes.
Yeah.
Don't stop waiting to be picked. Pick yourself. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That's great. Well, hopefully some of the students who listen to this may have an opportunity, or their teachers who may also listen to this may encourage some kids to get into podcasting, because I've heard the same thing. It's pretty much a wide open field right now, depending on what area you want to get into.
You know what else is really, really cool, Deborah, is many apps like Stitcher is one of my favorite podcasting apps. A lot of Android users use this, but some iPhone users as well. And Stitcher, as the name would imply, stitches your favorite shows together. So you can line up your shows, get in your car or wherever, and it'll play the first one, and then automatically go to the next one, and then the next one. And it's streaming the audio versus you having to download it to your phone. And the reason I mention Stitcher is because apps like Stitcher are cutting deals with automobile manufacturers to get prominent placement in their dashboards.
Oh, interesting.
And so there's the potential there for, if you're doing a podcast, there's potential now for your content to be in front of hundreds of thousands of people buying new cars. And I mean, how awesome is that?
That's pretty amazing. I hadn't heard of. I actually have Stitcher on my Android phone, but I haven't gotten into the streaming because I didn't want to get into the data.
If you don't have an unlimited data plan, it might be a little cumbersome, but
that's good to know. I'll have to look into that a little bit more. And the fact that it's going into cars is pretty amazing. Yeah, that's a huge business opportunity on a lot of levels.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Which skills do you think are most important for podcasting specifically? What kinds of skills?
Well, first, in whatever you do, I would say be you. Bring that uniqueness that is you to the table. Don't let anybody take that away from you. Your own personal worldview about things. Beyond that, as far as podcasting specifically, I would say know your target. Know who it is you want to reach, and define that down to what I would call a listener profile. A radio station I used to work for considered 18 to 34-year-old women to be our target demographic at this particular radio station. But whenever I was on the air, I wasn't thinking that broadly. I was thinking about a specific member of that group, a 28-year-old female whose name was Jennifer. She was married to Michael. They had 2 kids. She worked part-time outside the home. He worked at such and such business that was in the Nashville area where I was. Yeah. And so you think of them that specific. They may be things that you are making up off the top of your head about them, but think about who that person is, who you want that person to be, and then steer your content toward that individual, that laser-like focus. In addition to that, I would say whenever you're behind the microphone, speak as if you're speaking to one person. As I mentioned, podcasting and radio obviously are very intimate mediums, and I hear a lot of podcasters and DJs make it less intimate sounding when they say things like, "Hey, all you listeners out there, and we're so glad to have you all here." Little things like that are pet peeves of mine. I think you need to think about how someone is consuming your content, and with podcasting especially, it oftentimes is when they're alone. Yeah. And so if you can be careful to in the way that you word things to speak as if you're speaking to an individual, have the picture of that person I just described, whoever your target demographic is, have a picture representing that person in front of you, and then as you're speaking into the microphone, look at that picture and pretend as if you're talking to that individual, and it will make your show sound even more intimate. And people, if they meet you face to face, will say things like, "I feel like I know you," or "That show you did the other day, it seemed like it was just for me."
Yeah.
The last thing I would say is, excuse me, is be the moon and not the sun. the sun gets all the attention. This with the sun, everything else revolves around it.
Yep.
If you approach your show as if you're the sun and you think everyone else's world revolves around you and they're looking for, hanging on your every word, that's not the mindset to take. You want to be the moon, and what the moon does is reflect the sun's light. So you want to reflect back what's important to your listener, and to know what that is, again, you have to go back to number one. You have to know who that is. You have to know the target before you can reflect back to her what's important to her.
That's great. That's great. I actually heard you use that analogy in one of your podcasts. Was it with Ken Davis? I think it was.
Yeah, just last week. Yeah, that's something I learned from one of my talent coaches, Tommy Kramer, back in my early radio days. And Ken just loved that. He loved that illustration.
Yeah, it's a terrific illustration, and I think it's applicable in many situations beyond just podcasting or being on stage. But it certainly is a worthwhile analogy to remember.
I've found that to be so true, Deborah. Most of what I've learned in radio, I have found since leaving radio to be applicable to all kinds of marketing.
Yeah.
One of the things I just said: know your target, speak to one person, know what's important to them, and reflect that back. They're all marketing concepts in a nutshell, basically.
Right. That's great. Let's see, which social media skills do you think, kind of in general, do you find to be most important in your businesses? I mean, you've got I think it's called the brown nose media, right? And,
yes.
And also the podcasting. Which kind of social media skills? And when I say the social media skills, the things that I'm thinking about, the skills that I'm working on with the students are things like communication and curation and community and creativity and innovation and things like that. So I'm wondering, which of those skills do you find to be most important for what you're doing?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind when you asked the question was altruism.
Okay. That's at the very center of my circle. So, care and service, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have found that to serve me very, very well. That means, commenting on the works of others, adding value to other people and their platforms, giving encouragement and serving them without any sort of strings attached or expectations that they'll reciprocate, the favor you're giving them. I heard, I think it was Zig Ziglar. I'd say I heard this. I read this years ago. Zig Ziglar say, you'll get what you want when you help enough other people get what they want.
Right.
Chris Brogan, one of my favorite authors, who's going to be on the podcast in November, has a. Let's see, how did he say it? I just had it and I lost it. His philosophy is basically promote other people 10 times as often as you promote anything that you're doing.
Yeah.
And I found that to be a good rule of thumb. I'm not always successful at that ratio. Sometimes it's tempting to go the other way and to treat social media like a bullhorn.
Yeah.
Like it's all about making an announcement about what you're doing next, and that's, I think, one of the worst things you can do with it.
Yeah.
And so it's about sharing what's interesting to you that you think other people might also find interesting, and in doing so, establishing yourself as a thought leader in those things you're sharing that you find interesting. But then also being very altruistic and understanding that the more you can help other people, the better off you're going to be in the end, and the more willing people are going to be to want to help you.
That's right. I think Michael Hyatt has said it's kind of an 11-to-1 ratio, or very similar to the 10-to-1.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And being in Nashville, maybe you've run into him once in a while.
Every now and then, yeah.
Let's see. Let's go to reading a little bit. What's been the experience of reading in your own life? You talked a little bit about that early on, but I mean, what difference does it make in your life in terms of reading?
Well, I can give you some specific examples. For me, it was instrumental throughout my career, but particularly in my most recent radio job, starting back in 2008, before social media had really taken a stronghold in the mainstream. Facebook wasn't even quite mainstream yet in 2008. Twitter wasn't on most people's radar at all. It was only a couple of years old at that time. Right. And being in radio and broadcasting like I was, I viewed and saw that in my own mind, it seemed like social media was going to be something that we were going to need to figure out as radio properties and understand how to utilize and leverage. And so in that time, during that year, I just poured myself into reading people like Chris Brogan, his book Social Media 101 and Trust Agents. I had a chance to meet him actually in Nashville at one point. Tamara Weinberg wrote a book called The New Community Rules Marketing on the Social Web around that time. Mm-hmm. And so I just poured myself into this and learned everything that I could about social media, and then began implementing what I was learning in the stations that I was overseeing. And then that ended up getting noticed by the rest of our radio family. And over time, I realized, accidentally, really, that I was being viewed as the guy, the expert within our company on this particular area. And so I was invited to speak before our entire sales team and speak before our programming team, and then eventually go to the home office and speak to the executives on this topic and where I felt our radio stations needed to go in light of the internet and everything that it was, all the industries it was turning upside down. And that all came about because I was reading about these things that I wanted to know about, these things that I was developing a passion in. And had I not done that, I wouldn't have later been in those positions to be the person helping direct and guide and lead our future.
So actually reading can be a stepping stone even within your own company or your own business. Just if you're the one who becomes well known as being good at a particular area, just because you've read the 3 or 4 or 5 books that nobody else has read, that can be a stepping stone within your own company, I guess.
Yeah, it can. And I think I said this earlier, and I learned this a long time ago, and this was a real epiphany for me, because I thought to myself when I first heard this, is it really that easy? And it's that phrase, if you've read 5 books on a given subject, you essentially are an expert on that subject. You know more than probably 80 or 90% of the population knows about that subject. Yeah. And to not leverage that, to me, is just a waste,
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay. Well, over the last few years, what are some of the books that have been either most influential or most meaningful, or what are your top books most recently?
A couple this year that I really, really like and am talking about all the time, and then there's one I'll mention from a couple of years ago.
Okay.
But earlier this year, I read a book called Multipliers: How the Best Leaders Make Everyone Smarter. It's by a woman named Liz Weissman. She spells it like wise man, W-I-S-E-M-A-N, but it's pronounced Weissman, I believe.
Okay.
But the fascinating thing about this book, multipliers, basically is a word she describes or uses to describe the kind of leader who isn't insecure and isn't threatened by the brain power surrounding them. There are those leaders that she calls diminishers who kind of view themselves as the leader, as being that person who has to have all the answers, and the rest of you just need to carry out the vision and do what I ask you to do, and your opinion isn't really needed. Mm-hmm. And if it is given, they can feel threatened by it even sometimes, or worry about hiring people that are as smart or smarter than they are for fear that person might be viewed as being a better employee than them, and just those insecurities. That's what she calls a diminisher. Yeah. I've been both a multiplier and a diminisher in the past. And Lord knows I've worked for both diminishers and multipliers. But the last leader that I worked for at the last radio station I was at, Matt Austin, is definitely a multiplier. He's the guy who brought these books into the workplace, and was very passionate about leveraging the collective brain power of the room, and realizing that a rising tide lifts all boats. That if we can dive into these books and all become smarter, then that's better for all of us and better for the company. And so Multipliers, a great book to learn more about that. Linchpins, Are You Indispensable by Seth Godin. It's where that quote you mentioned comes from earlier. Stop waiting to be picked, pick yourself. And Linchpins, basically about how, in the workplace, being the absolute best employee you can be. And similar to what I was just describing about social media and reading and becoming that guy that everybody looked to on this topic, that's kind of a little bit about what Seth is getting into. It's about carving out your niche wherever you are, whether that's working for yourself or working for a company. And a great way to do that, as we have mentioned, is to read. And then lastly, I would mention, I just finished this book today, actually, and he's on the podcast next week. Todd Henry's Die Empty, Unleash Your Best Work Every Day.
I've heard of that book. Yeah.
Very, very good book. I won't spend a lot of time on it because I know we're short on time. But just a a book about making sure that you approach every day when it comes to your work and in life in general with intentionality. I'm hearing that word kicked around a lot. You mentioned Michael Hyatt. That's a word he likes
Yep.
to use
Yep.
quite often. And Todd's book is really just at its very core about being very intentional about everything that you do. And of course, with that it includes, being a good goal setter and all those kinds of things. But a very good book. In fact, it's, I don't know if you can see this or not, but probably more so than any book I've ever read. I have marked this up and put tabs everywhere. I've got Post-it notes filled. And never have I done this kind of
Okay.
note taking with a book until this one. So I highly recommend it.
Okay, I'll put that on my Amazon list. Okay, just a couple last questions.
Mm.
What have you, of all the guests that you've had, all these
Mm.
authors, have you noticed kind of any patterns of wisdom that that would be helpful for students to notice too? I mean, you've been doing this now once a week for several months, and what kinds of patterns are you noticing?
Well, I hinted at it earlier, but I would go back to this. Zig Ziglar and what he said about, you will get what you want when you help other people get what you want. Altruism, we've mentioned that. It's putting others ahead of yourself, really, is if there's one common thread of all the interviews I've done, it comes down to helping people. And whatever you're doing, if you can truly and sincerely be passionate about helping other people, my desire with the podcast and part of my reason for starting it was not just about scratching my own itches, but knowing that in this process, whether I get paid to do it or not, hopefully I can help people discover books they wouldn't have otherwise discovered, or learn concepts they wouldn't have otherwise learned. And so that for me, each and every day is the core and the crux of why I do that. So I would say helping people first and foremost, and making that job one, priority number one. Everything else kind of falls into place after that.
Okay. Well, that may answer my last question. I was going to ask you if you have any final takeaways or anything that you would want to share, either with students who are kind of just expanding into this whole online world, or with their teachers who are trying to teach them. I don't know. Maybe that's your big takeaway. Anything you want to add?
Well, I would say that in many industries, and I hinted at this earlier too.
Yeah.
There are no longer people whose job it is to keep you out. Now more than ever, you can share your passion with the world via the internet. The internet has democratized so many different industries: the music industry, print, broadcasting in a lot of ways, and many other industries. And so, if you have something you want to share with the world, the internet allows you to do that without having to get anybody else's permission. So I love that idea of not having to wait for permission anymore. I wish that was the case when I was younger, but there's still time. My heart's still beating, so it's not too late. As far as teachers inspiring students to read more, I would go back to, in school, I always viewed reading as a chore or homework. I mentioned, and it seems sort of obvious to me now, but I didn't realize, the extent to which, or the extent of what was out there in books and what I could really learn about. So make sure that students understand that no matter what their passion is, they can find books about that passion and dive into it even deeper and learn more about it.
Yeah.
Or maybe something they've thought they might like to do. One of the great ways to learn more about doing that is just finding books on that subject, and like we've said, read 4 or 5 books on the subject and become that expert on the subject, and then share what you learned, so that others can learn from you as well. Yeah. If the act of reading isn't something that you enjoy, I would encourage teachers to maybe encourage audiobooks. I know when I first started reading or listening to audiobooks, it was tough for me. I had to sort of train myself. I would hear a concept, or my mind would want to go off on a rabbit trail or a tangent, and then 10 minutes later I'd realize I'd missed the last 10 minutes of the book.
Right.
And so I've conditioned myself now. When that begins to happen, I know to stop or pause the recording. I allow my moment of creativity to happen, and then go back to the book. It took some trial and error, but eventually I was able to get to that point where that's sort of just automatic for me now.
Okay.
And it was really the impetus for my podcast. Is the first 3 months of this year, I made a goal of just reading a book a month, a very simple, easy to obtain or attain goal. And by the end of the first 3 months, I realized I had read 10 and was already into 11 and 12 books, and that was in large part because I was listening to books. So I was getting through books much more quickly, turning that hour 2 hour commute into a time of productivity
Yeah.
and learning. So maybe try that. Apps like Audible.com. There's Audiobooks.com also has a great mobile app as well, so you can take those books wherever you're going and really turn that time that's otherwise, especially commuting, but even jogging or working at the gym or working around the house, whatever, turn that time into a time of learning and productivity. So
yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, Jeff, I'd like to thank you for spending some time with us today. This has been a really terrific interview, and I'm sure that our students and teachers will really get a lot out of it. So thank you very, very much.
well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, and wish you all the best.
Okay, thanks.